you've got this powerful way of breaking this vice we're in, where we vacillate between narcissism and nihilism, and they of course are just aspect disguised. They're just two sides of the same coin, and it's very hard to break out of that within, because our culture drives us towards a third person perspective skepticism or a first person perspective solipsism, and we get locked, and those are the only two alternatives, and then the Zen Neoplatonism came in and said, no, you can smash that. Welcome everyone to the Lectern. I'm here with my beloved friend Ethan Hsieh, and we're going to talk about an upcoming course. I'm going to turn things over to Ethan because Ethan is the person who manages the program and works with all the instructors to coordinate everything and help basically, educate people about what the courses are and what they're offering. So welcome, Ethan.
Well, this is, thanks for that, John. And this is a topic and a course that is actually very close to my heart, because I wrestled a lot with nihilism as a young person. And, I just turned 35 last week, so I'm officially not a youth anymore. And because of that—
You are officially middle-aged.
Yes, I am. And, I have to also appreciate you, John, because I think a lot of the work that you've done helped me to come out of a place where the nihilistic worldview was all that I was really encountering day by day. And so, for me, being able to have a conversation with you about how this course might afford that, and particularly in deep diving into the Kyoto School of Philosophy, obviously my time in Japan is also very meaningful to me. I have a lot of personal stake in this conversation. Now, having said that, on an educational, more pedagogical kind of piece, one more thing that I really appreciate about this is that you're still now just about to wrap up Between East and West, which is the first course on Zen Neoplatonism. And we were just talking a moment ago off camera that this course, Notes on No Thing, is in a lot of ways complementary to Zen Neoplatonism. And so I'd like to invite you to kind of speak a little bit about how you might see that relationship. And then I want to we'll do some imaginal play, right? Toss a few kind of maybe proto encounters with that worldview. I can tap into a piece that I know well.
Well, yes. I mean, the Kyoto School was pivotal for me in my philosophical, existential, spiritual encounter with nihilism. Like many people, all I initially had was Western thinkers, Nietzsche, Camus, Sartre. And when I read Nishitani, both Religion and Nothingness and the Self-Overcoming of Nihilism, I found a deep alternative to absurdism or existentialism for dealing with the issues around nihilism. And I found it very helpful because it also helped me to get out of, this is the pilgrimage, get out of, the framework given to us by the European Enlightenment, the framework of modernity, and see not only was the nihilism from sort of the outside, but how the nihilism was bound up with that. And then of course later work, with my good friend, William Desmond, that developed from there. So Nishitani, and that book, which I consistently put in the top 5 books I've read in my life, I've gone through it twice individually and with other people. That book, I think, is powerful. Now, we won't be covering that book. We'll talk about that book in the argument, but I want to do his whole thing about nihilism, not just the one book, because I've done that already in Beyond Nihilism, which is coming out in a book that you and I are working on. But the Kyoto School, I think, is a powerful way for people who are addressing nihilism, and it doesn't cover the usual suspects about how we talk about or philosophically reflect on nihilism. It doesn't involve, well, here's existentialism, here's absurdism, here's perhaps stoicism, things like that. This is no, there's a radical other way of trying to understand nihilism. which is tremendously fruitful and dovetails very well with sort of bottoming out of the meaning crisis and reorienting towards the advent of the sacred. And in that sense, it ties in extremely well to Between East and West, where it's building, very carefully with the help of some really good thinkers, Bloom and Hahn, and especially David Hinton's astonishingly beautiful book, China Root, that if we properly reroute Zen in Daoism through Chan, and we properly unpack the Neoplatonism running through Ibn Arabi and Meister Eckhart, Islamic, Christian, also Spinoza and Jewish Neoplatonism, we have a profound way of creating a framework in which opponent processing is built right into the very depths, and you have convergence and divergence, and you've got this powerful way of breaking this vice we're in, where we vacillate between narcissism and nihilism, and they of course are just aspect disguised. They're just two sides of the same coin, and it's very hard to break out of that within, because our culture drives us towards a third person perspective skepticism or a first person perspective solipsism, and we get locked, and those are the only two alternatives, and then the Zen Neoplatonism came in and said, no, you can smash that, right? You can smash that. You can break through it by getting Chan, Zen, and Neoplatonism as a through line to talk deeply, to enter into dialogos with each other. So these two courses, I will definitely teach this new course, Notes on Nothing, as a standalone course, but it's also very complementary to Between East and West. Also, for any of you who have been, engaging in any of the work I've been doing about beyond nihilism or the advent of the sacred, this course is about, again, trying to keep, you were there, the Between East and West, it's on the cutting edge of the development of my own thinking, and not just my thinking, my whole way of seeing and being, right? It's bound up with all of that, about trying to find a way to reorient and recomport ourselves so that something like a completely legitimate, and I mean philosophically, scientifically legitimate, but nevertheless deeply transformative contact and conformity, participation in sacredness becomes available for us again. Because for me, that is the only full response to the problem of nihilism, is people who can re-encounter, re-realize, recognize sacredness again as active. This is also overlapping with all the work I'm doing right now on Iris Murdoch, and how this is the central core running through her thinking. I want to do a course eventually on Iris Murdoch, probably as part of this sort of pedagogical program on Zen Neoplatonism. So yeah, it's just it's an opportunity to get a breath of fresh air on these two interlocking issues: nihilism, the meaning crisis, and the related dimension of the advent of the sacred.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to double click on what you've said about it being kind of like a gateway into, you can open up into Jewish mysticism, you can open up into Sufism, you can open up into Neoplatonism. And, I will say that when I was still very much stuck in that kind of worldview, it's not that I wasn't looking at philosophy at all, particularly Eastern philosophy. I read a lot of yogic texts, I'm very into myth, right? I'm very into Jung as well. And my experience had been that Eastern philosophy is parked over there in the same lot as, say, a kind of more mystical kind of packaging. And then on the other hand, I have all these really hard, Cartesian thinkers, right? And they felt dichotomized in my experience, and I felt torn between two worlds. And so actually that same book, Religion and Nothingness, which I recommend to anyone I went on a date with in the past, in the years before I met Ellie, I told her, if you want to get to know me, read Religion and Nothingness. And a lot of that is because I think religion and nothingness has a way, Nishitani is a beautiful way of kind of like speaking directly to the reader as, hey, consider this, consider this, consider this. And in that, I think trying to capture at least a sense of that spirit, not in content, but in terms of like accessibility. Notes on Nothing strikes me as like a real powerful entry point to dip your toes into Eastern philosophy, because it opens up into the rest of this work. And I would say that, I would say that if you missed between East and West, like don't worry, Notes on Nothing isn't like a sequel. I would say that you can start with either Notes on Nothing or between East and West, and they will converge. You can read or watch either one first, and the order doesn't really matter. Now, having said all that, I want to just sort of like start by kind of seeding the ground of how I hear nihilism in our pop culture, and we do this fun little role play thing, and we'll see where it takes us, right?
Okay.
But if I sort of stand in that place, what's something I hear? Okay. Let's just do this in direct speech. John, sometimes I feel nihilistic. Like, so, it's like I can't get up, and then I don't really want to do anything. Like I can't really get out of bed. I can't really, I don't want to go to work. Because actually there's no real point, right? So that's just the way it is. So if I get up and I go to my job and I just get back at like 6 and I sit down and I watch TV, right? It's like, that's kind of it. So I don't think that's bad. Like I'm quite happy with that. So I feel it doesn't feel nice, but it's like, what are you going to do about it? Right.
So, as long as it's clear in your mind that you're not actually suffering from like clinical depression, because that should be therapeutically treated, but that this is a philosophical existential stance for you. Of course, it will have an affective dimension to it, but it's like you're saying, I still have happiness. I like my job, perhaps. I have some friends. That's what I kind of hear you saying. It's just that when I sit back, at the end of the day, and I look over my life as a whole, it's like, and what's the point? And that's important, because you have to, if that becomes a philosophical understanding, not an effective defect, but a philosophical understanding of the nature of reality, that's just the way it is, then you're into asking yourself, well, how do I know that is a good or the best account of the nature of reality, just the way it is? And the problem you might get when you hear me talking that way is like, oh, you're going off into all this highfalutin talk. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, oh, well, where are you standing when you stand back to look at your life? And how do you know that's the only place you can stand back to? And how do you know that's the best place to stand back to look at your life? See, what we do is we are basically moving from our everyday perspective to another perspective we have learned. We've learned it from other people, or we've learned it from our culture. How do you know that perspective is actually a really good one for you, from which you should stand to reflect back upon your everyday life?
But I think that's the point. At that point, right, it's like it's thinking too much at that point. Like, there's no need to consider whether or not it's the best life. It's like when I stand back, I say, okay, do I have food to eat? Yes. Do I have a job? Yes. Are my kids okay? Are they healthy? Okay, fine. Then that's it. Like, there's nothing, I don't need to step back and back and back, right?
Okay, so the framework is highlighting the needs you need to address, yes? That's what that framework is making salient to you. And again, so now I can just re-ask you a question. How do you know, like, how would you know that you have properly oriented to all the needs that you do need to address? What if you have a need for meaning in a powerful way that is constitutive of the very way you're an agent or a self or a person or a participant in a particular worldview? And whether you want to acknowledge it or not, you are a participant in a worldview. You have imbibed and internalized a whole bunch of models of how the world should be understood and how you should understand it. When one of those models are misleading you, you admit that there's wrong frameworks, right? Like let's say a Marxist is a framework that tells you the need for the revolution should be the need you're focusing on. Okay, so different frameworks give you different, they foreground and highlight different needs. How do you know the framework you're stepping back into is getting all the needs that you really need addressed?
Because when I step back, I look at it and see, okay, my kids are happy, right? If I feel like, okay, well, I ate something, I feel full. Like everything is satisfactory, actually, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, if I step back and I look at that framework, and I go, well, is full really full? Then I start to feel bad because it's like, oh, now I have regrets of like I should have had the steak instead of the lobster, for example, right?
Right.
So, but actually, I can just be peaceful enough with, okay, I had this, that's fine. I don't need anything more, right? So the desire, the whatever attachment that I have, whatever kind of I don't need to torture myself with the regrets or the suffering. Otherwise, I'm just hurting myself at that point. It's better to just look at everything and say, okay, am I happy? I'm happy. So done.
So have you ever noticed that, like, if you clench your fist really tight, you're strangling it for blood? And then when you first open your fist to get the blood back, is that a pleasure experience or first a painful experience? There's a bit of pain at first, right?
Yeah, it feels a bit like pain, like tense and pain, then it gets like cold and numb.
Right. And then after a while, your hand gets a full circulation of blood, yes?
Yeah.
So sometimes when we're locked into something, initially breaking out of it will feel painful, will feel cold, numbing, because we are trying to bring back life to something that has been starved for life. So if that's possible even in something like this, could it not also be possible for your mind that your mind gets locked and trying to unlock it could initially bring a sense of, oh, that's uncomfortable, that hurts, I'm going numb. But it might be that, wait, maybe I have to push a little farther because that might be the signs that I'm actually getting a more expansive grip on reality that I wasn't capable of before.
Yeah, but then, John, I would just say I don't have to do the clenching of the fist.
You already are clenched. That's what I'm telling you.
How?
So you are already holding on to a way of looking at the world. When I asked you to consider moving to other perspectives, you said, I don't want to. I don't need to. You're clenched. You're limiting yourself. You're claiming that anything that's, although you admitted that it's very probable that your framework is blinding you to certain needs because other frameworks clearly do, you, without examining it, were assured that there were no needs that you need to meet, right? That weren't being addressed by your framework. That sounds like clenching to me.